Chapter 1. Jumping off the deep end, totally losing her mind, had taken longer than expected, but it had finally happened. Abigail Martin stared up at the sweeping Victorian house and let out a sigh. Crazy. Absolutely, completely crazy. Maybe her mother really had been right about her all along. But she was here, all the same, chasing some story, desperate to know the truth, hoping for a miracle of her own. Her friend Maddie had insisted, though she wouldn't give any details, that prayers were answered behind these walls. Something just a few months ago Abigail would have never believed. Now, well, she had to find out for herself. Nice place. The masculine voice behind her brought a cringe. She turned to look at Evan, who lifted his eyebrows skeptically. Why did he have to come? Bad enough his parents had sent him to pick her up from the airport. She told him no less than 6 times she didn't need his help with her suitcase. Sure I can't get you to stay at my parents'? He cast a skeptical glance at the house. And share a room with Sarah? Both Evan and his sister would stay in their old rooms at their parents' house for the long holiday weekend. Staying with the Blakes would mean spending Thanksgiving trapped with Evan's entire family, close quarters with people she'd avoided, and a million probing questions. She couldn't think of a better way to torture herself. Maddie highly recommended this place. Besides, staying at your house would be too weird. Evan didn't comment. He knew what she meant. Even though they hadn't spoken in months, she had no doubt he could still read her far too easily, which was exactly why he shouldn't be here. Wind, too chilly for Ocean Springs, Mississippi in November, tickled down the back of her neck, and she shivered. She hated the cold. Come on. He didn't move. What's this really about? Like he didn't already know. This is about Atlanta, isn't it? And there it was. The reason she didn't want to spend the holidays with Evan's family, even though she cared more for them than she did her own. They knew too much. They'd asked too many questions. Calling them had been a bad idea, a desperate act in a moment of weakness. No, she needed to get away. Like, far away. Or at least try her luck at a miracle. She glanced again at the B&B and wondered at her own gullibility. But then, obviously, Maddie had gotten exactly what she'd wanted. A husband. Would this house somehow produce what Abigail longed for as well? She couldn't find out until she got rid of Evan. Abigail shot him a scathing look. Can we go in now? I'm freezing. Evan shook his head, his blue eyes saying more than his lips. He felt sorry for her. Nothing like being the object of pity to make a girl feel desirable. Not that she wanted Evan to desire her. They were friends. At least, they used to be. But that was over. She marched up the wide front steps and onto the wraparound porch. Evan plodded along behind her. She pressed the doorbell and waited. Evan stood close to her, the enticing scent of his cologne digging up memories better forgotten. Had it really been almost 10 years since she'd first laid eyes on him as a lanky high school freshman, and her silly heart had gone into major crush mode? She dared a glance at his strong jawline. Funny how being away from him for a year brought up ancient feelings. Abigail stiffened, trying to gain a hold on the way his nearness heightened her senses. Stupid. She'd conquered that ridiculous attraction a long time ago. Friends. They'd been better off as friends. They'd maintained their unusual friendship nearly all the way through college, with him being the popular jock and her being, well, her. They'd been close, despite their differences. At least until he turned his back on their friendship and... The front door swung open, bringing Abigail's thoughts to a jarring halt. A short woman grinned at them. She wore a blue gown that made her look as if she had unnaturally wide hips, with a skirt fashioned from what had to be dozens of yards of embroidered fabric. The square neckline was dotted with gaudy bows. Her graying curls had been piled high and topped with a little white cap. The woman stared at Abigail as openly as Abigail stared at the woman's ornate costume. Maddie hadn't mentioned crazy outfits. Evan chuckled, and Abigail jabbed her elbow into his ribs, the laugh cut off with a grunt. Maddie had warned her about the quirky lady who ran this Victorian inn called the Depot, but the woman's outfit still took Abigail by surprise. "Renaissance fair in town?" Evan asked. The woman smiled at Evan sympathetically. "Wrong era, dear. I take it you're not familiar with history?" Abigail couldn't help but laugh. The woman spoke sweetly, mischief dancing in her eyes. Evan shifted his feet, appearing adequately embarrassed. Looked as if Abigail had finally found someone who could rattle that man's unshakable confidence. "Sorry, ma'am," he said. "Mrs. Easley." She swept a gaze over him. "And you are?" "Evan Blake." He glanced at Abigail again, but she merely smirked. Something about this lady in period costume had him rattled. "Mr. Blake, so that you are not caught unaware, I shall enlighten you on a bit of history." She waved for them to enter the house and closed the door on the chilly wind behind them. Inside, the foyer of the grand house was washed in warm yellow gaslight, and the air smelled of sugar cookies. But Abigail didn't get any weird tingles. No sense of the magical. There didn't seem to be anything special about this house, aside from the intricately carved molding and fine craftsmanship. Well, that and the woman in the elaborate costume. "This," Mrs. Easley said, gesturing down at her gown, "is not a dress from the Renaissance. It's the height of ladies' fashion from 1773. Looking somewhat sheepish, Evan nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Abigail smirked. Mrs. Easley's eyes swung her way. "You must be Miss Martin. Are you familiar with the time period?" "Aside from elementary school history class?" "Not particularly." "Oh, that will present some challenges, I suppose." She waved a hand. "But no matter. Let's get you checked in, shall we? I've already looked up your room number." She eyed Evan again. "No room for this young man, though. Curious." "He's not staying, just helping me with my luggage." The statement brought a smile to Mrs. Easley's lined face. "How gentlemanly." Her gaze swept over him again, assessing. "Curious, indeed." She gave a dip of her chin. "I'll get your key, dear." As soon as the woman turned her back, Evan leaned close to Abigail's ear. "That woman is 7 shades of weird." Abigail shrugged. She'd been expecting the owner to be eccentric. "She's just playing a part. Didn't you read the sign?" "What sign?" Evan watched the woman sweep away through the doorway, her wide skirt brushing the frame on both sides. "The one outside that talked about stepping back in time." Evan rolled his eyes. "You pick the worst places." She cringed at the dig, as if her confidence weren't already at an all-time low. "Sorry." He wrapped an arm around her shoulder and tucked her against his side. "You know I only meant this house." "I know." He probably hadn't meant to poke her with a jab about her terrible choices. She was just too sensitive. She stepped out of his embrace. Warm eyes watched her. Why did he have to be here? He'd shown up at the airport instead of his mother. If Abigail hadn't needed to ration what few funds she still had, she would have called an Uber in the first place. Calling Connie Blake had cost her. The conversation about why she'd refused to answer any of Evan's calls or texts was a time bomb she hoped she could continue to avoid. So far, she'd been able to turn aside Miss Connie's questions by saying she needed a little time before she was ready to answer. Women understood things like that. But then Evan had peppered her the entire ride over from the airport, and she'd used every vague answer and evasive maneuver she could think of. Now she could see the question in his eyes again, and she was running out of excuses. She stepped toward the doorway. "Abs, I've missed you. Tell me the truth. Why didn't you answer?" "She's coming back." Mrs. Easley appeared a second later with a gigantic black key. She held it out to Abigail. You'll be in room 2. She looked at Evan again. You plan on going all the way up with her? If it's all the same to you. Abigail withheld a groan. He'd follow her until he cornered her and forced conversations she didn't want to have. At the very least, he'd try to talk her out of staying. She didn't need him pointing out all the reasons she shouldn't take a room at the Victorian Inn. Her plan was tenuous at best. If he made too many logical points about how she shouldn't spend money on her room, money she didn't have, she'd probably cave and go to his parents' house. And she didn't want that. Abs, are you sure you... Abigail cut him off and fired a question at Mrs. Easley. Do you remember my friend, Mattie Palmer? Mrs. Easley's eyes jumped from Evan to her, and a broad smile lit her face. Of course. Are she and the captain doing well? Happily married. She clasped her hands, clearly delighted. Oh, how wonderful. I love how everything works out according to his plan. Evan relaxed next to her, a subtle easing of his shoulders, a slight release of breath. Things she only noticed because she knew him so well. Had the woman's reference to God set him at ease? Interesting. Regardless, maybe now he wouldn't pester her about staying here. Mrs. Easley gestured up the stairs, and Abigail gripped the key. Before the woman could turn away, she said, This might sound weird, but I'm curious. Did anything, she glanced at Evan, unusual happen to Mattie and Nate while they were here? The woman lifted her eyebrows. What do you classify as unusual? Abigail had a suspicion, something that Mattie had hinted at but hadn't said outright, something totally and completely impossible. Time travel. The suspicion had brought Abigail here. The ridiculous hope that she could find a way to go back and undo what she'd done in Atlanta. Or at the very least, go to the beginning of her family's problems and see the truth for herself. Evan tensed beside her again, and she could feel his eyes boring into her, almost as though he thought he could dig into her brain and find answers there. Stupid. Why hadn't she waited until Evan was gone to ask? Her and her wayward mouth. When would she ever learn to think before talking? Saying bizarre things out loud, especially in front of Evan, would lead him to dragging her out of here and straight to his sister. And she did not need a forced session with a shrink. Regardless of what people kept saying, she wasn't crazy. Abigail laughed it off. You know, magical moments to fall in love. A slow smile curved Mrs. Easley's lips. Is that what you came here for? Uh-oh. This was going downhill in a hurry. Laughing again, though it sounded painfully forced, Abigail waved a hand as though she could shoo away the awkwardness. Nope. Just want to get away. Do something new. Mrs. Easley smirked. Leaving troubles behind and finding something new is our specialty. She felt, rather than saw, Evan roll his eyes. Offer still stands, Abs. Before she could think better of what was probably another terrible choice, Abigail marched up the stairs. After 3 steps, Evan scrambled after her. She'll need your help, son, Mrs. Easley called after them. Do try to keep an open mind. That woman is wacko, Evan grumbled as soon as they reached the top of the stairs. You need to get out of here. I'm staying. Now, if for no other reason than the fact that he was telling her not to. Then I will too. That's stupid. He planted his feet in the middle of the hallway. What's gotten into you? Not only have you refused to talk to me since you left for Atlanta, but now you're acting like I'm your enemy. Pain flicked in his eyes. Can we talk? I just need a little space. Time to think things through. Evan watched her a second, then stepped closer. More time than all those months in Atlanta? She refused to answer, but he kept watching her anyway, as though he could read her thoughts on her face. After a moment, he sighed. You seem to be searching for something. And there he was, decoding her again. She reached for the familiar comfort of sarcasm. I'm looking for a place to spend my time off where people won't pepper me with a million questions. Not even a cringe. I'm here for you. You know that, right? She offered a tight smile. I'm in room 2. Must be down the hall. She whirled around and scurried away. Interesting paintings, Evan said behind her. The out-of-place statement caught her off guard. She paused. What? Evan gestured to a frame hanging on the wall in front of him. Woman must be obsessed with the Revolutionary period. He was baiting her, trying to keep her talking. Rooms this way. If he wasn't going to follow, she'd grab her suitcase out of the hall later. Huh. Now what? She turned again. Evan was leaning close to the picture, squinting. That man looks like me. Just leave the suitcase. I'll get it. I'm serious. He reached out and touched the painting, but suddenly jerked back as though something had bitten him. Evan stumbled and grabbed at his chest. Abigail screamed. She reached him just as he crumpled to the floor. Help! Someone help! She dropped to her knees beside him, grabbing his face in her hands. Heat suddenly poured through her. Her head swam. Dizzy. Why was she so dizzy? Should have never... Everything went black.